Welcome, dear friend. The day has grown quiet now, and as you settle in beneath your blankets, let us take a slow, gentle walk back in time, to a place where the air is scented with wood smoke, where the tick of the clock is steady and patient, and where the world moves at the soft pace of a carriage along a quiet lane. It is late evening in a Victorian home, sometime in the latter half of the 19th century. In the quiet elegance of a Victorian home, the figure of the father was one of deliberate composure. He was the steady beam at the center of family life, the presence that gave the household its shape and stability. His love was not a love that called attention to itself with effusive gestures or constant verbal affirmation. Instead, it was a love built upon the quiet authority of his role, the unspoken understanding that he stood between his family and the uncertainties of the outside world. To the modern mind, such restraint can seem distant, perhaps even cold, but within the customs of his time, this manner of affection was not neglect. It was a considered way of giving, one that valued steadiness over sentimentality. To live in the Victorian era was to live in a world where order and propriety were regarded as virtues in themselves. This sensibility reached into the family, shaping the way fathers were expected to conduct themselves. A man's worth was measured not only by his ability to provide, but by the manner in which he held his household in quiet control. The father was the symbolic anchor of the home. He might not involve himself in every detail of daily domestic life. That often fell to the mother, but his influence was felt in the way the rules were set, the way expectations were shaped, and the way each member of the household found their place within the family's structure. Quiet authority was not about raising one's voice or exerting force. It was about embodying a kind of moral weight. The father's words, when they came, carried significance because they were measured, not scattered freely. He might speak only briefly at the supper table, his conversation sometimes reserved for matters of work or the wider world, but the tone in which he spoke and the manner in which he listened told his children that he was to be taken seriously. In an age without the constant hum of machinery or the distraction of screens, such moments of attention from him were felt all the more keenly. The rhythms of his life were deliberate. Mornings might begin early, with the sound of boots on the wooden floorboards and the faint scent of pipe tobacco or cologne. The household understood his routine, the carefully pressed suit, the neatly folded newspaper, the same steady departure to work each day. His absence during the hours of daylight was not cause for concern. It was the understood pattern, the necessary arrangement by which the home was kept secure. And in the evening, when his key turned in the lock and the door opened to the cooler air of dusk, there was a subtle shift in the household atmosphere, a sense of completeness returning. His quiet authority was felt most in how he carried himself. He did not need to demand attention, for his presence alone was enough to settle the room. Children who were playing might lower their voices when he entered. A softening would pass through the space, not out of fear, but out of respect. He was a man of his time, taught to believe that a firm demeanor was part of being a good father, that excessive familiarity might weaken the respect that held the family together. Love, in his mind, was best expressed by ensuring his family was well clothed, well-fed, and guided by a moral compass that would serve them in adulthood. The way he spoke to his children was often formal, but never unkind. There might be a gentle pat on the shoulder after a lesson well learned, or a rare smile when a child showed unexpected ingenuity. These were his ways of showing approval, not with a cascade of praise, but with a simple acknowledgement that meant far more because it was not given lightly. For him, to be sparing with words and gestures was not to withhold love, but to make it precious. And yet, beneath the formality, there was a quiet warmth that those who knew him best could feel. It might reveal itself in small, easily overlooked ways. the extra piece of bread left for the child who had worked hard in the garden, the way he checked that the windows were latched against the night air before retiring, the silent pride in his eyes when a child's handwriting had improved. These gestures were not the exuberant displays of affection that later generations might favor, but they were acts of care nonetheless. His authority was never meant to overshadow his children, but to hold them in a kind of protective structure, like the frame that supports a painting without obscuring its colors. Quiet authority also meant that he did not need to dominate conversation or command constant obedience with threats. His role was built on consistency. The children knew what he stood for. They understood his boundaries because they did not change from day to day. In a world that could be unpredictable, where illness might come suddenly, where work could be uncertain, this constancy was a source of comfort. They knew that the father they saw today would be the same father they saw tomorrow, and that his approval could be earned by meeting the clear, unchanging standards he set. In the evenings, after supper, the family might gather in the drawing room. The fire would burn low, the air carrying the faint, sweet tang of coal smoke. The father might sit with a book, spectacles balanced on the bridge of his nose, reading in a low, even tone. Sometimes he would read aloud to the family, passages from a novel or an article from the day's paper. And though his voice was calm and without flourish, there was something reassuring about its steadiness. He was not performing for applause. He was simply sharing a moment, and in that sharing, he was teaching his children that the quiet presence of a loved one could be its own kind of comfort. On rare occasions, a child might ask for something that broke the usual reserve, perhaps a seat on his knee, or permission to linger a little longer before bed. If he agreed, the granting of that request felt like a gift, not just because it broke with the formal routine, but because it came from a place of choice rather than habit. In that moment, his quiet authority softened into something more openly tender, and it was precisely the rarity of such moments that gave them their lasting sweetness. The child would carry that memory like a small ember of warmth, glowing long after the evening had passed. The culture of the Victorian era often kept emotional expression contained, and this containment shaped fathers as much as it did mothers and children. Yet within those boundaries, a man could still find ways to convey his devotion. Quiet authority was not about withholding love. It was about giving it in a form that the times understood as dignified and enduring. He may not have spoken the words, "I love you," often, but in his unwavering commitment, in the security of his presence, in the steady way he fulfilled his role, that love was expressed again and again. Even when he was not in the room, his influence lingered. The rules he had set, the example he had given in matters of honesty, patience, and restraint, all continued to shape the life of the household. Children would think twice before acting against those principles, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a quiet desire to live up to the standards he embodied. His authority was not the brittle kind that cracked under pressure. It was the enduring kind that grew from consistency, fairness, and a genuine sense of responsibility. As the years passed and the children grew, they would come to understand more of what their father's quiet authority had meant. In their own adult lives, they would find themselves drawing on his example, the steadiness in times of uncertainty, the care in small things, the belief that one's word should be kept. They might remember, with a certain nostalgia, the sound of his measured footsteps on the stairs, or the way his voice would rise slightly when speaking of something he believed to be important. They would remember that he never rushed, never allowed himself to be flustered, and never made promises he could not keep. And when they thought of him in the context of their childhood, it would not be the absence of constant hugs or overflowing words that stood out. It would be the sense that he was always there, a quiet figure of strength and guidance. His love was the kind that did not shout, but simply remained, day after day, as reliable as the turning of the seasons. In this way, quiet authority became a legacy. It was a gift shaped not by the fashions of the moment, but by something deeper, the belief that a father's role was to be a constant, steady light, guiding his family through whatever came. And though the world has changed since those Victorian days, there remains something timeless in that image, a figure who stands calmly in the center of the home, offering a love that is felt not in its volume, but in its steadfast presence. Affection in the Victorian home was a delicate and measured thing, especially between fathers and their children. It was not absent, but it was wrapped in layers of restraint, shaped by a culture that prized composure and self-control above spontaneous emotion. In that era, a hug was not an everyday occurrence. It was something to be asked for, something granted with intention. To modern sensibilities, this might seem overly formal, even distant, but within the soft lamplight and quiet rhythms of a 19th century household, such restraint gave physical affection a particular weight and meaning. The father's manner toward his children was one of gentle reserve. He might watch them with a fondness he would not put into words, a fondness that lived in the way his eyes softened when a child entered the room, or the way he lingered a moment longer before leaving for work. And yet, if a child longed to cross that invisible barrier of formality to rest against his arm, to feel the warmth of his hand, they would often pause, gathering the courage to speak the simple request. "May I sit with you, Father?" The question was quiet, almost ceremonial, and it was in that asking that the moment began to take on its tenderness. Permission was rarely denied, but the very act of having to ask created a certain reverence for the closeness that followed. When a father opened his arms or gave a small nod of assent, the embrace that came was not casual, it was a gift. The child, knowing it was not given lightly or habitually, would sink into it with the full awareness that it was special. And the father, for all his formality, would hold the child with a care that contradicted his usual reserve. In that brief exchange, the strict outlines of Victorian etiquette softened, and the warmth of human connection shone through. The rarity of such moments meant they were remembered vividly. A child might recall the feel of the father's wool waistcoat against their cheek, the faint scent of tobacco and starch in the fabric, the steady beat of his heart beneath the layers of clothing. They might remember the weight of his hand resting gently against their back, not patting or fussing, but simply existing as a solid point of reassurance. And when the moment ended, it was not hurried. The father would release them slowly, as if acknowledging that this, too, had mattered to him. In the quiet evenings, when the fire's glow painted the room in shades of amber and gold, such requests for closeness might come more easily. The day's work was done, the household's needs attended to, and the father, though still dignified in bearing, might be more receptive to a child approaching his chair. The child would stand nearby, perhaps fidgeting with the hem of their nightshirt, then venture the request. If granted, they would settle carefully beside him, feeling the quiet solidity of his presence. No words were needed. The comfort came simply from being allowed to stay close. This ritual of permission did not diminish love. Rather, it heightened it. In a time when open displays of affection were rare, each one became more significant. The very scarcity of hugs meant that each one carried a deeper emotional imprint, a reminder that love could be both powerful and understated. The child grew to understand that affection was not something to be taken for granted, but something to be valued, cherished, and remembered. There was also a cultural logic to this restraint. The Victorian ideal of manhood placed emphasis on discipline, reserve, and the maintenance of moral authority within the family. Too much familiarity, it was believed, could blur the lines of respect and obedience. A father's role was to guide and to protect, not to indulge in sentimentality, at least not openly. This belief did not come from a lack of feeling, but from a conviction that love was best expressed through the provision of security, education, and moral guidance. Physical closeness was permitted, but it was framed as an exception to the rule, a moment of softness that did not undermine the structure of authority, and yet, for all the restraint, there was an unspoken understanding between father and child. When permission was granted, there was no stiffness in the embrace. The father did not give a half-hearted pat and then push the child away. He simply allowed the moment to be, holding them with the quiet strength of a man who carried the weight of the family on his shoulders. His silence in those moments was not a sign of emotional absence. It was the silence of someone who knew that no words were needed. Outside the home, life in the Victorian era was often brisk and impersonal. Streets bustled with carriages, shops rang with the clink of coins, and the air carried the mingled scents of industry and coal smoke. In that wider world, there was little room for softness, especially for men whose reputations depended on composure. The home, however, was a different space, a place where, behind closed doors, the father could allow small cracks in the armor of dignity. These cracks did not appear often, but when they did, they became the most treasured moments in a child's memory. On winter nights, especially, the desire for closeness was more keenly felt. The wind would press against the windows, and the steady tick of the clock would seem louder in the hush. A child, wrapped in flannel, might wander into the room where the father sat reading by lamplight. The warmth of the fire, the low rustle of pages turning, the faint smell of burning coal, all these would combine to create an atmosphere of safety. And in that safety, the child might gather the courage to ask for a hug. The father, setting aside his book, would nod, and the child would climb into his lap. For a time, the world outside ceased to exist. Even as the years passed and children grew taller, the memory of those granted embraces would remain. They would remember how it felt to be small enough to fit entirely within the circle of their father's arms, how the world seemed simpler in that space, how the fire's warmth and his presence blended into one. In adulthood, they might realize that these moments, though few, had been their father's way of saying, "You are loved and you are safe." The permission to hug was, in a way, a lesson in patience and appreciation. It taught children that not everything precious in life could be had instantly or without thought. Some things required the humility to ask, the courage to approach, and the awareness to treasure what was given. In this way, the ritual reinforced the very values the father sought to instill: respect, gratitude, and the understanding that love, while not always loud or constant, could be deeply enduring. And so, in the soft glow of memory, the image of the Victorian father remains, seated in his chair, dignified but approachable, his hands resting in his lap until a child's quiet request prompts him to open his arms. The hug is given without haste, received with silent joy, and then released, leaving behind a warmth that lasts long after the moment has passed. It is this rhythm, the restraint, the asking, the granting, the cherishing, that defines the nature of affection in that time and place. And while the world has changed, the quiet power of such moments remains timeless, speaking to a truth that transcends any era, that love, when given with intention, is felt all the more deeply. The Victorian household moved with a rhythm that was both deliberate and unhurried, as if time itself respected the boundaries of home. From the moment the day began until its gentle close, there was a quiet choreography to life, each action flowing into the next without hurry or strain. The home was not a place of constant activity or restless noise, but a refuge from the world outside, a world that could be loud, uncertain, and fast-changing. Within these walls, life followed a pattern that gave the family a sense of stability, security, and peace. Morning arrived softly, not with sudden clamor, but with the gradual light of day seeping in through lace curtains. The first sounds were small and familiar: the faint hiss of the kettle in the kitchen, the creak of floorboards under measured footsteps, the muffled clink of crockery being set out for breakfast. Fires were coaxed back to life with the patient stir of iron pokers, sending out waves of warmth that filled the rooms. The air carried the comforting scent of bread warming in the oven and tea leaves steeping in their pot. The father's place in this morning rhythm was as steady as the clock on the mantel. He descended the stairs at the same hour each day, his attire neat, his expression calm. There was no rush in his movements, but also no waste of time. The children knew to be ready, to greet him with quiet respect as he entered the breakfast room. The table was set in an orderly fashion, the silver polished, the napkins folded just so, not for show, but because these small habits were part of the family's sense of order. After breakfast, the father would leave for his work in town, his boots tapping evenly along the stone path. His departure was part of the household's daily heartbeat, not a disruption, but a natural beat in the measure of their lives. The home settled into its daytime rhythm, the mother tending to household affairs, the servants moving about their tasks, the children attending lessons or chores. Each role was clear, each responsibility understood. In this clarity, there was comfort. No one was left wondering what the day might demand of them. The Victorian belief in order extended beyond schedules. It lived in the very way rooms were kept and spaces were used. Drawing rooms were tidy, their furniture polished to a soft glow, cushions plumped, curtains tied back just so. Hallways were free of clutter, staircases swept daily. Not only did this give the home a pleasing appearance, it also fostered an atmosphere of calm. There was nothing chaotic to trip the eye or mind. The space itself invited stillness. When the father returned in the late afternoon or evening, the rhythm shifted again. His arrival was not a loud event, but a quiet moment of completion, the family gathering back into its whole form. Coats were hung, boots cleaned, and the evening unfolded in a familiar sequence. Supper at the table, conversation at a measured pace, and afterward, the retreat to the drawing room. The fire would be lit, if it wasn't already, casting a warm glow on the patterned wallpaper and sending flickers of light into the corners of the room. It was during these evening hours that the unhurried pace of the household became most tangible. There was no rush to fill every silence. Pauses in conversation were not awkward but restful. The father might sit with a newspaper, the children quietly reading or playing with a board game, the ticking of the clock steady in the background. Sometimes he would speak, offering a story from his day or commenting on some item in the paper, and the family would listen, each voice taking its turn, no one interrupting. This measured flow of daily life gave the children a sense of safety. In a time when the world outside could be unpredictable with news of political changes, economic challenges, or illnesses sweeping through communities, the home remained constant. The same meals were served in the same dishes, the same routines followed without fuss. This was not dullness, but reassurance. It was the knowledge that tomorrow, like today, would unfold with the same gentle shape. Even the way the home was lit played a role in this atmosphere of order. Daylight filtered softly through tall windows during the day, while evenings were bathed in the golden glow of oil lamps and candlelight. The shadows they cast were steady, not flickering with the harshness of gaslight. This subdued illumination encouraged slower movements, quieter voices, and a feeling that the world beyond the windows was far away. There was also a subtle discipline in the pace of the household. Tasks were done properly, without haste, because rushing was considered not only careless but disrespectful to the work itself. Polishing the silver, brushing a coat, or folding linen, these were done with patient hands. The father's own manner reflected this. Whether he was reading, writing a letter, or speaking to his children, he gave the task or person before him his full attention. In his steadiness, he modeled the value of presence, of doing one thing at a time with care. This atmosphere of order extended to the children's interactions with him. They knew when to approach with questions, when to wait, when to speak, and when to listen. Far from creating distance, these patterns provided a sense of harmony. There was no uncertainty about his mood or his expectations. The predictability of his behavior made him approachable in his own quiet way. On Sundays, the rhythm of the home slowed even further. The family might attend church together, walking at a dignified pace through the crisp morning air, then return for a midday meal that was lingered over. The afternoons were given to rest reading, light conversation, perhaps a walk in the garden. These slower days reinforced the idea that life did not need to be constantly full to be meaningful. In the depths of winter, the order of the home became even more of a comfort. With early darkness falling outside, the family drew closer around the hearth. Curtains were drawn, shutting out the cold night, and the rooms became small islands of light and warmth. The father might settle in his armchair, a blanket over his knees. The children gathered near, each absorbed in their own quiet pastime. The only sounds were the occasional crack of the fire, the turning of a page, and the steady breath of those who were content simply to be there together. This peaceful domestic rhythm did not happen by accident. It was cultivated. The father's steady demeanor was one part of it, but so too were the countless small habits that formed the family's way of living. Just as the clock kept its steady beat, so did the home keep its measured pace. There was a time for work, a time for rest, and a time for togetherness, each given its proper place. To live in such a home was to be wrapped in a sense of continuity. Children grew up knowing the shape of their days, the feel of their evenings, the sound of their home settling into stillness at night. And as they grew older, they would look back and understand that this unhurried rhythm had been a quiet gift, a steady foundation upon which their memories rested. The father's role in this was not in grand gestures, but in the way he upheld the pace of the household, never allowing it to rush towards something it did not need, never letting it drift into disorder. In this way, the atmosphere of order was not a restriction, but a freedom, the freedom to live without the anxiety of constant change, the freedom to find joy in small, repeated moments, the freedom to trust that tomorrow's sunrise would bring not disruption, but the same gentle cadence that had carried them through today. There were many ways love could be spoken without words in a Victorian home, and many of them lived in the smallest of gestures. Fathers of that time, bound by the quiet dignity their role required, often found their tenderness not in sweeping declarations, but in subtle, almost invisible acts. These were not the kinds of moments that would have been recognized as affection by those outside the home, nor would they have been remarked upon at the time, and yet, for the children who received them, these small expressions carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken "I love yous." It might be something as simple as the way a father paused to listen when a child spoke. Truly listen, setting aside his newspaper or pipe to give his full attention. His gaze would rest on the child, his expression calm, absorbing each word with a seriousness that told them they mattered. This listening was not hurried or distracted. It was deliberate, and in its quiet way, it assured the child that their thoughts were worth hearing. Sometimes care was shown in the granting of permissions that were not always expected. A father who allowed a child to stay up a little later on a winter's evening to hear the last part of a story by the fire, or to accompany him to the garden in the fading light, was offering more than change to the routine. He was offering a shared moment, a quiet companionship that said, "You are welcome in my world for this time." These permissions were rare enough to feel special, and because they were rare, they were treasured. There was care, too, in the physical environment he helped maintain. A father who ensured that boots were mended, that there was always coal for the fire, that the roof did not leak when it rained. These were acts of love disguised as responsibilities. The Victorian father might not say aloud that he wanted his children to be warm and safe, but every practical measure he took to keep the household in order was an unspoken expression of that desire. At the supper table, his affection might appear in the smallest of offerings, a second helping of something he knew his child liked, slid onto their plate with no comment. The quiet saving of a treat from his own day to be brought home and placed on the kitchen counter. The way he waited until everyone else had taken their share before serving himself, making certain no one went without. These were not grand gestures, but they spoke volumes about where his priorities lay. On certain days, the expression of care might take the form of shared work. A child helping their father in the garden or workshop might find that the conversation between them was lighter, freer, when hands were busy. There might be no formal lesson, but the child would watch the way the father measured each cut of wood or checked the soil with patient care. In these moments, the father was teaching not only a skill, but a way of approaching the world with steadiness, precision, and respect for the task at hand. Even the way he moved through the house could hold meaning. A father who checked each door and window before bed, making sure all was secure, was not simply following a routine. He was silently telling his family, "I am here to keep you safe." The children might not notice this consciously at the time, but they would feel it, that quiet watchfulness, that unseen guardianship. There were also moments of protection that required no confrontation, only quiet intervention. A father might sense a child's discomfort in the presence of visitors and subtly adjust the conversation, giving them an excuse to slip away. He might notice that a task set for a younger child was proving too difficult and find a way to help without making them feel incapable. In these ways, he was attuned to the needs of his children, even when they did not voice them. When a child was unwell, the father's care might be most clearly felt. Though the mother often tended directly to the sick, the father would make his own contributions. A fresh stack of firewood to keep the room warm, a quiet inquiry to the doctor about the best course of treatment, the bringing home of a small comfort, perhaps an orange in winter, or a sweet wrapped in paper. He might sit by the bedside for a time, not saying much, but letting his presence be a reassurance. The slow weight of his hand resting gently over the blank, it could be as healing as any medicine. The way he spoke could also carry an undercurrent of tenderness. A father's voice, measured and calm, could make even a correction feel like a form of guidance rather than a rebuke. He would rarely raise it in anger. Instead, he relied on the quiet authority that came from being consistent and fair. This was love in its guiding form, a love that wanted his children to grow into good people, capable and principled. Sometimes, the most telling expressions of care came when no one was looking. A father might pause in the hallway to listen to the sound of his children playing, a faint smile touching his face. He might keep a small trinket a child had given him, a crude drawing, a pressed flower tucked away in a drawer, safe from loss. These private acknowledgments were his way of honoring the bond between them, even if he never spoke of it. Evenings were often the richest time for such subtle expressions. The father, seated in his chair, might look up from his book to meet his child's eyes across the room, sharing a small smile that needed no words. He might adjust a blanket around a child who had dozed off by the fire, making sure they were comfortable before he himself retired. These were moments without ceremony, yet they stayed with the child for years because they were rooted in genuine, attentive love. When his children achieved something, whether in their studies, their music, or simply in mastering a small skill, the father's pride might show in a softened expression, a slight nod, perhaps a quiet "well done." It was not the praise itself that mattered most, but the way it was given, sincerely, without exaggeration, as if to say, "I see your effort, and it pleases me." In the Victorian world, where restraint was a virtue, such words carried far more weight than constant applause ever could. Over time, these small, steady acts wove themselves into the fabric of the family's life. The children might not have thought of them as love in the sense the modern world describes it, but they felt its effects: the confidence that someone cared for their well-being, that someone noticed their needs, that someone was quietly proud of them. And when they grew older, looking back across the years, they would see it clearly: the father who rose each day to provide, who listened when they spoke, who gave them warmth and shelter and safety without ever making a spectacle of his care. They would remember the hand on their shoulder, the plate pushed gently toward them, the blanket adjusted when they were half asleep. They would realize that in those small moments lived the heart of their father's love, steady, enduring, and utterly reliable. This was the Victorian father's way, not to shout his feelings into the world, but to let them seep quietly into the lives of his children, so that long after he was gone, those subtle expressions of care would remain, shaping the way they themselves loved and cared for others. It was a love that lived in the spaces between words, in the quiet of the evening, in the simple act of being there always, without fail. In the Victorian era, the cultural climate shaped not only how people dressed, spoke, and worked, but also how they related to one another within the family home. Fathers were particularly influenced by the prevailing ideals of composure, restraint, and an unwavering sense of propriety. The measure of a man was often taken not by his capacity for affectionate display, but by his ability to embody a quiet dignity that reflected stability and respectability. This was not necessarily the absence of love. Rather, it was the love that had been filtered through the lens of an era that valued self-discipline and emotional reserve. The roots of this restrained approach lay deep in Victorian society's collective values. Public life was guided by rules of decorum, and the home, though private, was still influenced by these same expectations. Fathers were taught from their own upbringing that the best way to raise a child was to model composure, to avoid the volatility of emotion, and to ensure that every act was measured and appropriate. A father who allowed himself to be too free with sentiment was at risk, in the eyes of his peers, of undermining his authority. Authority, after all, was seen as the backbone of familial stability. In daily life, this meant that fathers often engaged with their children in structured ways. They might read to them in the evenings, ask them about their schoolwork, or instruct them in the skills and manners needed to navigate polite society. Conversation was often formal, especially at the dinner table, where a child might be addressed by name and expected to respond with polite precision. While this could appear cold to the modern observer, within the Victorian framework, it was a sign of respect. Children were treated as young people to be guided firmly toward adulthood. Affection, when it did appear, was often understated. A father might express pride not with a hearty embrace, but with a nod of approval, a rare smile, or the granting of a small privilege. These subtle cues were meant to teach children that acknowledgement from a parent was something to be earned, not assumed. In the absence of frequent physical affection, these small moments took on a weight and importance that would be deeply felt. A pat on the head or a gentle squeeze of the shoulder might linger in memory for years because of its rarity. The composure that defined Victorian fatherhood extended beyond physical expression to the way emotions were managed. Public displays of frustration, anger, or sadness were discouraged, and the home was no exception. Fathers sought to maintain an even temper, believing that stability in their demeanor would help instill a sense of security in their children. Even in moments of correction or disappointment, the ideal was to speak with firmness rather than raised voices. The lesson being modeled was that self-mastery was a mark of character, and that one should never be ruled by one's passions. The influence of such cultural norms was reinforced by the literature, art, and sermons of the time. Popular books and periodicals praised the virtues of the strong, silent father, whose love was constant but often invisible in its outward forms. Religious teachings frequently reinforced the idea of the father as the head of the household, wise, steady, and above the sway of impulse. A father's role was to protect and provide, not to indulge sentimentality. In this light, restraint became a moral duty, an expression of care through constancy rather than touch. Yet beneath this cultivated reserve, many fathers still felt deep affection for their children. Diaries, letters, and private memoirs from the era reveal men who were proud of their sons and tender toward their daughters, even if they expressed it more freely in writing than in person. They might write of missing their child's presence while away on business, or of quietly rejoicing at a child's small success. These moments of confession show that the cultural mask of restraint did not erase genuine emotion. It simply redirected it into quieter, more contained channels. In the rhythms of the Victorian household, the father's presence was often a stabilizing force. His predictable habits, coming home at a set hour, sitting in his favorite chair, reading by the fire, created a sense of order. Even without overt displays of affection, children could feel a father's care in the structure he provided. The very fact that life moved along with a certain steadiness was its own form of comfort. It told the child, without words, that they were under the watchful protection of someone who would not easily be shaken by life's unpredictability. This cultural reserve also shaped how fathers interacted with the wider community. A man's reputation depended in part on how well he embodied these values in both public and private. Gossip or observation could travel quickly in tightly knit Victorian neighborhoods, and a father's behavior at home might indirectly influence how his family was received in society. Thus, maintaining an image of calm authority was not only a matter of personal pride, but also a way to safeguard the family's social standing. While modern perspectives may view such restraint as emotionally limiting, it is important to understand it in context. In an age when survival often depended on resilience, and when public opinion could make or break one's livelihood, emotional discipline was seen as a virtue. Fathers believed they were preparing their children for a world that would demand endurance and self-control. By modeling composure, they hoped to give them the tools to navigate life with dignity. The quiet dignity of the Victorian father, then, was not simply a matter of coldness or detachment. It was an intentional way of being shaped by the values of the time, a belief that love was shown through constancy, discipline, and the absence of volatility. While this style of parenting left little room for spontaneous warmth, it was rich in the kind of stability that children of that era came to rely upon. The very reserve that kept fathers from embracing their children freely was, in their eyes, part of the duty they owed to them, to be a pillar of calm in a changing and often uncertain world. In a Victorian home, the rare moment of physical closeness between a father and his child carried a weight far beyond its brief duration. It was not the everyday gesture it might be in later times, but something steeped in formality, anticipation, and a deep unspoken meaning. The culture of the era had shaped fathers into men of restraint, men who were taught that emotion, if not hidden, should at least be carefully managed. For them, an embrace was not a casual reflex but a conscious decision, often preceded by a pause, a look, perhaps even a small spoken request. This rarity did not diminish love. It intensified it, transforming a simple hug into a quiet ceremony. Imagine the drawing room in the early evening, the fire crackling low in the grate, shadows playing gently along the patterned wallpaper. The father, dressed in his dark wool suit, sits in a high-backed chair, the day's labors still lingering faintly in the creases of his face. The air carries a faint scent of coal smoke, mingled with the delicate perfume of beeswax polish on the furniture. The ticking of the clock on the mantel forms a slow, steady rhythm, a background to the silence that often filled these rooms. In such an atmosphere, a child might stand nearby, clutching a small book or toy, summoning the courage to speak the words that would bridge the gap between affection desired and affection allowed. "May I have a hug, Papa?" It is not a plea nor a demand, but a question wrapped in reverence. And the father, setting aside his paper or pipe, would look down with eyes that softened almost imperceptibly. He would rise slowly, perhaps smoothing his waistcoat, and bend to draw the child into his arms. That moment, fleeting as it was, carried an entire world within it. For the child, it was warmth, the firmness of a steady chest, the faint scent of tobacco and wool, the reassurance of safety. For the father, it was an unspoken confession of love, one that bypassed the rigid rules of decorum without breaking them. It was as though, for those few heartbeats, the entire architecture of Victorian restraint bent just enough to let affection flow freely. In these rare embraces, the silence was as important as the touch. No hurried words or lavish declarations accompanied them. Instead, there was the quiet hum of the fire, the soft rustle of fabric, the slow, almost meditative release of tension in both father and child. It was not only a meeting of arms but of worlds, the adult's burdened, disciplined existence meeting the child's open, yearning spirit. And perhaps this is why such moments stayed so vividly in memory. They were not diluted by frequency, but preserved whole, like a single pressed flower in the pages of life. Outside these intimate exchanges, affection often took different forms: practical gestures, careful provisions, lessons in conduct. But the hug, when granted, became a distillation of all those things into one simple human connection. It was a wordless promise: "I am here and I care for you." And though it might be days, even weeks, before such closeness occurred again, the memory of it would carry a child through the long stretches of formal distance. When viewed through modern eyes, this might seem unnecessarily cold or restrained, yet within the framework of Victorian values, the rarity gave the gesture its sacredness. Love, when so carefully guarded, took on a gravity that shaped the child's understanding of it for life. To be embraced was not a casual right, but a meaningful privilege, one that echoed softly in the heart long after the moment had passed. In the hushed warmth of the parlor, with the fire burning low and the clock marking the passage of quiet minutes, that rare hug became something timeless, a tender pause in the steady march of Victorian life. In the Victorian era, the father's role was bound tightly to a set of expectations that placed him as the unshakable pillar of the household. His love was meant to be real and deep, yet shown in ways that rarely resembled the open emotional displays we might associate with affection today. By the time a child reached adulthood, they often looked back on their father's behavior through the lens of these societal norms, recognizing only then how much care was embedded in small, seemingly distant acts. It was not that the Victorian father lacked tenderness. Rather, the channels through which he expressed it were shaped by a culture that valued composure, propriety, and the careful guarding of emotions. For many children, the father's presence was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. He was the one whose voice could command a room, whose approval was sought but not always easily gained. His love was measured in consistency, not in overt sentiment. He might rise early, work long hours, and return home late, his every effort aimed at maintaining the family's stability. To the Victorian mind, this constancy was itself a form of devotion, a sacrifice of personal ease and emotional indulgence for the sake of duty. The father's very reliability was his love, even if he did not frame it that way aloud. When he did show emotion, it was often in moments of shared silence or subtle gestures that the child might not fully grasp until years later. Perhaps it was the way he lingered by the doorway before leaving for work, casting a quick glance toward the nursery. Perhaps it was the extra slice of bread saved for a child who had a fondness for it, placed on their plate without comment. These were not declarations of love in words, they were declarations in action. In a society where outward displays of sentiment could be seen as a weakness in men, such quiet acts carried the weight of deep, unspoken feeling. The absence of constant emotional expression also shaped how children understood the value of those moments when it did break through. A father's rare smile, a firm hand placed on the shoulder in encouragement, or an approving nod during a lesson. These became treasured memories. The scarcity of such moments did not diminish their meaning, it amplified it. A single word of praise could ring in a child's memory for weeks. A quiet walk together, even without conversation, could feel like a binding thread of connection. Victorian fathers also saw themselves as moral guides, shaping the character of their children not only through instruction, but through example. Integrity, self-control, and perseverance were considered cornerstones of a proper upbringing. The father, who lived by these values, believed he was passing down more than material security. He was instilling in his children the ability to navigate life with dignity. While modern perspectives might long for more open communication and affection, the Victorian father might have argued that the discipline and moral fiber he modeled were his truest gifts of love. Still, the emotional distance that sometimes resulted from this model of fatherhood could leave children yearning for more warmth. Some grew to understand and respect their father's reserved style. Others, even into adulthood, might struggle with the sense that love had been withheld. But often, with time, many came to reinterpret those early years. They realized that the structure, the protection, the sacrifices, and even the restraint were forms of care uniquely fitted to the era's ideals. In the later stages of life, when the strict demands of work had eased and the rigidity of social expectations softened, some fathers allowed more open affection to emerge. Grandchildren, in particular, often received a gentler, more openly loving version of the man their parents had known as stern and composed. These later years could offer children a glimpse of what had always been present under the surface, a heart deeply tied to family, even if it had long been wrapped in the garments of formality. For the Victorian father, love was something to be proven through steadfastness rather than proclaimed in words. His children might not have heard him say, "I love you," or seen him rush forward for an embrace, but they felt his commitment in the way he stood as the anchor of the household. In his mind, the safety of the home, the provision of food and shelter, the moral example set, and the enduring consistency of his role were the ultimate expressions of paternal devotion. And for many who grew up under his care, those silent proofs of love became the enduring foundation of their own understanding of what it meant to be cared for, even if it took a lifetime to fully see it.